What's this you see on the screen? Besides my pretty face, I mean. Murkwater Scourge is the monthly reward card for March for the Elder Scrolls Legends. Bethesda announced it today. As you can see on the screen, this is a 4-cost agility creature, has a 3/1 body, and I'll talk a bit about the body in a moment. It's a goblin, which I'll also talk a bit about, but the effect is rather interesting, rather neat. It has both Summon and Last Gasp, and both of them are put a curse into your hand. So first I want to talk a bit about this being a goblin. It's cute because the article that was released with the card reveal talked about playing this in Tribal and talked about maybe even using Training Grounds from last month. And I say cute because you're not going to do either of those things. Training Grounds is still not good enough even if you're running goblins. And if I'm being honest, as far as like the Goblin Tribal deck goes, Murkwater Scourge isn't going to help that out a whole lot. At most, this would replace where you may or may not have already been running Murkwater Shaman, and in most cases, the Goblin decks were either not running it or it was a 1 or a 2 of, because it's just too slow. This is a little bit quicker, but the stat line, which is what I'm going to talk about next, is also a bit of a detriment because you're paying 4 for essentially a 3/1 body and what you want to be a very aggressive deck if you're running the Goblin Tribal. So, if you're not looking at this from a Goblin perspective, in my opinion, you're looking at this in either a mid-range, specifically a tempo-oriented mid-range list, or you're looking at this for control. Now, the first thing I want to talk about is the mid-range tempo list. On first glance, it just doesn't seem very good because you're spending 4 for a 3/1 body, and let's be honest, it's just not great. 4 is what you pay for Bleak Coast Troll, or the Black Dragon, or, some other monstrous stat line. A 3/1 does not help that game plan. Now, yes, this curves nicely into Leaf Lurker, so if you've already got a tempo advantage, and then you play this on 4 into a Leaf Lurker on 5 to deny your opponent tempo, it could help. So, if you lead off with Mournhold Trader, and then you lead off with, an impressive 3-drop, playing this into Leaf Lurker is a really powerful tempo play. However, if you don't have the tempo lead, if you're not the one pressuring, and you don't start with that Mournhold Trader or something else that's equally ridiculous in the early game, then this feels really bad when you're kind of trying to play from behind in a traditional mid-range list. And yeah, so here's the thing about the stat line. 4 for a 3/1 feels bad, but really what you're getting out of this is 4 for a 5/3. It's just that the extra stats are being paid for when you take them away from your opponent as opposed to on the body of the creature itself. It's very similar to Shearpoint Dragon in that sense, right? Shearpoint Dragon costs 6 for a 4/4 body, which doesn't feel great, but you get a -2/-2, so really, in essence, you're paying 6 to get 6 worth of stats. It's just how they're distributed. And it's the same thing here. Really, you're paying 4 for essentially a 5/3 worth of stats, assuming that you get the Last Gasp. Now that's where the trick, the caveat comes into play here, because there's an awful lot of silence floating around. Earthbone Spinner, still a card, has been since the inception of the game. Sorcerer's Negation, still really prevalent on the ladder. So there's lots of ways to deny the Last Gasp portion, and if you're paying 4 for what's essentially a 4/2 at that point, it feels pretty bad. So in my opinion, if you're going to play this card, you've got to maximize the value. That means maybe Swindler's Market decks, which could be kind of cute because of the extra curses involved. However, most of those decks kind of died when Skulk died, and they were already really hampered by Northwind Outpost going from 2 to 3 cost a long time ago. So they're kind of on their last limb. In theory, this card is actually really good for something like an assassin deck that is wanting to do things with Hexmage. Being able to put, 2 curses into your hand, and if you play multiple Murkwater Scourges, multiple curses, that would allow you to play a Hexmage and then just generate a lot of damage while also getting control of the board, hopefully, at that point. Combining this with Leaf Lurker is great. Combining it with Shearpoint Dragon is great. So if you are playing some sort of either tempo-based archer or, again, an assassin-style deck, I could see it seeing play there. I don't think it's going to be enough to, like, revitalize those archetypes. But if I saw one in there, like, I wouldn't be surprised. I think that this definitely replaces most Murkwater Shaman in decks that were already running Murkwater Shaman, because sacrificing 2 health for a guaranteed single curse out of it is probably still better. We live in a world where immediate value is essential in Legends. So cards with summon effects are great. Cards that have an immediate board impact are great. And long-term effects like Murkwater Shaman are just not good enough anymore. So this, again, could fill that role. But most of those decks already were not seeing a ton of play to begin with. So could it be played there? Yeah. Am I going to be surprised if it's played there? Not at all. Do I think it's going to revitalize those decks? I don't know. I'll probably try it because I'm a sucker for those kinds of decks. And I'm sure I'll find some mid-level of success and be ranting and raving about how much I love the card. But the reality is the power level isn't too huge there. Now, one place where it is kind of sneaky good is mid-range Halalu. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, Charmer, that doesn't exist. But hear me out. Haunted Manor, more mid-range style Halalu decks that are not the all-out aggro versions, but are instead planning on trying to grind out a game with, you know, a couple of big threats, or you play a couple of threats per turn to get that Haunted Manor value, things like that. I think there's room for those decks to see a little bit more play, and I think that something like Murkwater Scourge could find itself in a deck like that. Probably not as a 3 of, but maybe a 1 or a 2 of as like a good tech choice. And I like it in a deck like that because the curses are a great way to trigger plot. Because sometimes you want to, for example, you really want to play your Halalu Sharpshooter, but if you're also playing Haunted Manor, you don't want the Sharpshooter to be the card that gets the buff, because typically you want it to be something with guard or something with charge, so you get extra value out of the additional stats. So giving yourself a card like Scourge that can give you curses that you can then set up plot for Sharpshooter, let you use that ability, and then still play a second creature to get a buff from a manor might have some value. Again, I know I'm stretching here, I know I'm reaching, but I'm just trying to think about like mid-range applications. Now, the last bit I want to talk about is actually control, specifically Dagoth and Telvanni control. A 3/1 stat line doesn't matter in a control deck if you are getting any value out of it at all, and this lets you do that. This is, how do I want to put this? It's not quite elusive schemer, but it's on a similar power level. You're paying 4 for a 3/1. Your draw a card is essentially draw a curse, but you have the potential of just getting another curse out of it. And sometimes that's good enough. And in specifically, you know, Dagoth, where you might have Leaf Lurkers or other wound removal effects, it could be very, very powerful. Or Telvanni, where you might not necessarily run Leaf Lurker because you've just got a bunch of other powerful effects, but you could still use a card like this. Like, I think about Telvanni specifically because Devaith's experiments with this card could be hilarious. I think about cards like Dark Rebirth with this card, even more so if you have like a shear point on the board or something like that. Like, you can set up scenarios where this card is actually an enabler that would allow you to almost machine gun down the enemy's board. So, you know, again, like if you've got a shear point on the board, you play a Scourge and then you Dark Rebirth it, for example, you're probably going to wipe the enemy board at that stage of the game, or at least in a control style deck, you would be pretty close to it. So, you know, again, is it going to be something that tips those decks any more than they were already favored? Probably not. Those decks were already good. You know, maybe the Dagoth version might see some cheeky uses out of this, but Telvanni's already really strong. To be honest, I'm not even sure if this is good enough to fit there, but I think I want to try it, or at least experiment with it when it does come out, because it's strong. It's actually interesting because it's a 3/1. If this card was a 2/1, I would be all over this, because Necromancer in this card would be absolutely insane. So I do actually think it was pretty heads up, pretty smart that they made this a 3-1 just to kind of combat that. But I like the idea of it in potentially Dagoth control, and then maybe experimenting with it in a Telvanni version that runs experiments, because not that you need any more board wipes in that deck, but giving yourself more ways to deal with warded creatures or some of the other resilient creatures, I think, is interesting. And that's where I think I want to try it out, is tempo-based mid-range decks, even though, again, it doesn't really help you if you're behind, but it does perpetuate and enable your game plan. If you are ahead, it helps keep you ahead, which is still important in those decks. And I do want to toy around with it in control decks that have access to Dark Rebirth and or similar effects. So that's my train of thought. My initial judgment is that this is good, not great. I think it's going to be great in Arena. In Constructed, it's going to be one of those cards that will see play. Whether or not it makes it into optimized lists, I don't know. And if it does, it's probably not as a 3 of. I think it's a decent tech choice in certain situations. Yeah. Certainly good enough to make it into singleton decks. So if you're like a big fan of singleton Telvanni, because that's actually a thing, believe it or not, I think it certainly belongs there. But yeah, I want to know what you guys think. You know, was there a combo or something that I'm forgetting? Is there a certain deck you want to try it out in? Do you think I'm wrong and it does belong in goblins? Are you going to play it with training grounds like the article suggests? Please, gods, no. Anyway, monthly reward card. I'm excited to try it out, which is more than I can say about last month. So there's that anyway. Let me know what you think. As always, thanks for watching. Until next time, may you walk on warm sands.